Thomas came out here with his lovely wife from Utah, just for us. And without further ado, Thomas Estrada.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us out. This is a huge treat for us. I'm from Southern California originally. I ended up, I live just outside of Salt Lake City now. But I started my career, well, even before my career, when I was a little kid back in the late 70s and early 80s. Like a lot of little boys, I used to love drawing hot rods and monsters. And I eventually found out about Rat Fink. I would see it in magazines and different types of stuff. And so Rat Fink was something that probably one of the first things that I used to draw when I was a kid. And I just grew up drawing all the time. That was my passion. That was the one thing that I was somewhat good at, that I felt, and the one thing that I was just passionate about, that I just wanted to do all the time. And so growing up drawing Rat Fink and hot rods and monsters and all that stuff was just kind of the thing that I did. Well, as I got older and started pursuing art professionally, being in Southern California, I eventually was able to make my way into the animation industry. I broke into animation in 1997 with DreamWorks, and it was on their very first animated film, was called The Prince of Egypt, was the movie I worked on. Anyone remember that movie, The Prince of Egypt? Cool. And if you remember any of these, just let me know, or raise your hand or say something, it would be cool. So I worked on that film, The Prince of Egypt, was my first one, and then eventually went to work on a movie called The Road to El Dorado. From there I made my way to Disney after DreamWorks. Disney was right down the street from DreamWorks, where the studios are in Burbank and Glendale. And so when I first got hired full-time at Disney, was working on, it's kind of a tiny little image, see if I can find the bigger one, was working on a movie containing this guy, if you remember the theme song guy, was a movie called The Emperor's New Groove. So from there I went on to work on Atlantis, and then from there it was Treasure Planet, and then there was a cow movie in there at Disney called The Home on the Range. I worked on that one.
Roseanne Barr?
Yes. From there, I went back to DreamWorks to work on DreamWorks' last hand-drawn film. Does anyone remember DreamWorks' last hand-drawn film before they went to computer animation? Shout it out. No, Prince of Egypt was their first hand-drawn film. Their last hand-drawn film was a movie called Sinbad. So I worked on that one. And then from there, everything switched over to computer animation. And so a lot of us had to learn this new medium, this new tool. And so I was fortunate enough to make that leap into the CG world, where I landed on the epic, almighty Shark Tale. Anyone love Shark Tale? It hasn't aged real well. I was happy to work on it because I was able to get into CG animation, and that kind of got my career up and going again, because hand-drawn animation was kind of coming to an end. And so from Shark Tale, I stayed at DreamWorks and worked on the next one, was called Over the Hedge, was a CG film. But because I learned all this new computer animation stuff, I was able to get into, like, this is a quick little demo thing here. It shows about how the computer animation stuff works. If we can get it to run, we'll see. But because I learned this new tool with computer animation, that opened a lot of new doors to video games. And so I was able to start doing some video game animation. I worked on games such as God of War 2, Gears of War 2. I worked on the first Uncharted, Drake's Fortune. There was a couple of Spyro the Dragon games in there. And then that eventually led me to coming out to Salt Lake City, where we were making Disney Infinity for Disney Interactive, and then as well as a couple other Disney games. I think we did Cars 3 and a couple of those. And then Disney ended up, when Infinity ended, the studio in Salt Lake City was reopened under WB, and there we all went to work with back to work with Warner Brothers on their first big title. I think that they're actually still working on is a Harry Potter Hogwarts Legacy game that they're doing there in Salt Lake City. So I worked on that for a few months. From there, I started drawing again and pursuing some of my own stuff. And with the drawing, I started doing a lot of Comic-Cons because of my animation background. And I was just having fun drawing a lot of that stuff again that I hadn't done for so long. And so I eventually resigned from Warner Brothers, which was like the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. I quit my job to go full-time freelance and just to start doing full-time illustration and drawing. And that opened a lot of really cool doors. Doing that, I eventually got to work with the Foo Fighters. I worked with a lot of different celebrity car builders like Dave Kindig and Danny Coker, and with Count Customs, different rock bands and that kind of thing. And because I had this kind of free time to draw whatever I wanted, being full-time freelance again, I started messing around with just a lot of the nostalgia stuff that I used to do when I was a kid. And one of those was Rat Fink. You know, I was just kind of messing around, and I thought, wow, I haven't drawn Rat Fink in a long time, and so I started playing around with it again. And from there I eventually got introduced to Eileen Roth, who is Ed Roth's widow, and she runs the estate and has the copyright. And so she signed me on as an official licensed Rat Fink artist. And so that kind of led to all this, which is why I'm here. So it's been kind of this whole circle of life thing where I started with Rat Fink as a kid, went through all this animation stuff, which is kind of funny, you know, Rat Fink being kind of the bizarro Mickey Mouse. I worked, you know, did Rat Fink as a kid, worked for Disney, and then now all the way back to Rat Fink again. So that's kind of a quick little, just kind of where it all, my career just in a nutshell there. One of the cool things that I was happy that I was able to do is when I got into animation, it was at a time when we were still doing hand-drawn animation. You know, we were drawing on paper and with pencils and working on cells. And it was a really cool thing for me because we don't see a lot of that hand-drawn stuff anymore. You know, it's all moved to CG. And so I was fortunate to be able to be part of that, working on films like Emperor's New Groove, Prince of Egypt, Rotel Dorado, where we were still drawing on paper and flipping pages. And it was an interesting time because it's changed a lot. You know, the way the animation worked back then, if you're familiar with 2D hand-drawn animation, is, you know, we're literally drawing iterations of the character flipping across the pages. Kind of how it worked when I was there is I was an assistant animator, and basically that meant is I would get the first drawing from my supervisor. It might be drawing number 1, and then they would give me drawing number 10 or whatever that number may be, and it's like it could be a drawing of the character facing this way, then number 10 is facing this way, and you would take those 2 sheets of paper, put them on a light box for those who aren't familiar with it, and you would flip it back and forth and just see the character moving. And then as the assistant, you would put your piece of paper on top of those 2 with the light shining through, and you can see those 2 images, and you would draw the halfway point. And then you would break those down until you have all the iterations, and you can put the paper in between your fingers and roll them all and see the animation kind of moving that way. And the way feature film ran is 24 frames per second, and what they would do is they would shoot each of those drawings, and they would use a single drawing for every 2 frames of film, which meant that was being animated on 2s, and then oftentimes though, they would have to shoot a single drawing for every frame when it was animated on 1s, and so you would imagine 24 separate images, drawings, would create on a frame of film, would create 1 second worth of animation at 24 frames per second. Back then when I was doing these movies, I remember my quota was about 35 drawings a week, which was really difficult to do. And so after a whole week of work, I would have just over a second worth of animation. So it was a really slow, tedious process. And so that's kind of how we did it all for all those hand-drawn films. And so then eventually when it switched to computer animation, what it was is now, rather than drawing each of those iterations on paper, now what you had was kind of like what we saw with the Mike Wazowski, is you had a character model that was now built on the screen. You can mess around with it like that. So rather than now drawing each of those, you would have a 3D model that was built for you, and the animator would take that model and it would have all the controls all over his body like you see there. And now we would create the animation by posing that character, and it's almost like virtual stop motion animation, where we would rotate the arms and the legs and we would put it in the pose, and then you would hit save. Then you can go now to frame 10 or whatever that might be, repose him again, and you're moving it all around and hit save. And you do that, 100 times, depending on how long your scene is. And then the computer now will interpolate all of those poses, so now you have that animation going the same way. But kind of where the magic of the animation comes in is manipulating those poses in a way to make it feel alive and feel like it's an actual living character that you're looking at. Because on the computer and even on paper, everything is weightless. Nothing has weight on paper on the computer. And part of making animation believable, one of those things is creating this illusion of weight in a character. Because I'll say, like, for instance, if we were to animate either on paper or on the computer, like a bouncing ball, and if I had the ball down on the ground, and then on frame 10, it comes up in the air, and frame 20, it's back on the ground again, the computer, or even on paper, it would just interpolate it very evenly. It would go up, and then it would come back down. And if you saw that animation, it doesn't really feel believable. And one of those reasons is there's no weight. And so the animator has to manipulate those drawings or the model on the computer to make it feel like it has some weight. And so how do we do that? One of the ways is when the ball is up top here, you would use a lot of frames and have the ball really close to each other so that the computer or the paper has to play all those frames, so it's going to slow down because it has to play all these little interpolations. But then, when we want it to speed up, we have this drawing here, and then we may put the next one all the way down here. So now the computer, or on paper, is going to play it from here to here. It's got to travel much further in a shorter time, so that's automatically going to make it feel heavy. It's going to make it go from there to there. So now your bouncing ball is going. So by creating that, you're creating this illusion that this ball now has weight by slowing it down and speeding it up. So now imagine applying that same principle to a character, so when he's taking a step, we're going to have him slow down when he's coming up in the passing position, and then from here to here, it's going to speed up. So now you have a character that's going, and you add some sound effects, and you have other things moving around, like if he's got a tail and that kind of thing. Suddenly that character feels like it's got some weight to it, and it's now much more believable. And so that's the cool stuff with animation, is creating that illusion that something is heavy. And then you can play around with that, like, is he a tiny character that's going to bounce around, or is he a big lumbering character? So all those things you're playing around with to make that illusion, so when you're watching that on the screen, it doesn't really happen, it's just the animator is kind of creating that. Does that make sense? And so there's a lot of these really cool little animation tricks that they use. Even things like just a simple head turn. You may have the character here and then look over there. Well, the same thing, if you just have it look straight across, the computer on paper is just going to make it feel like it's on a rail, and it's not going to feel very believable. But if you do little tricks like you have the head dip down and then come back up, or you put an eye blink in between there, those little things like putting stuff on arcs suddenly make it feel much more natural and believable. So you have the, this kind of thing, and it's like, oh, that's a nice little touch. And so they found as if you move things on arcs, like if he's just moving his finger here, but if you go down and back up again, it feels much more natural. Then you could even do things like drag the finger and then have it come back out. Instead of everything hitting at the same time, you may have the hand hit and then the fingers come afterwards. And so all those little things, eye blinks, things moving on arcs, things dragging, having stuff follow behind and then follow through, all that stuff is how the animation works and what makes it feel so lifelike. And they developed all those way back with Walt Disney and his animators when they were doing Mickey Mouse and then eventually Snow White. They started finding out all those little principles. It was like, oh, if we do this and we do the eye blink, and it's like, it's gonna just feel much more believable. And the cool thing is you could spend your entire career trying to master all those things. And kind of the sad part is if you get it down really well and you see a really cool animated film like at Pixar and all those principles are working really well, you don't even think about it because it just does it so well. And it's always the really bad animation that stands out, which is kind of sad. If you do your job really well and have all those principles down, nobody notices them because it's all so natural. And so that's kind of the fun little part about that. So anyways, so that's kind of how the animation stuff worked and how we, I spent my whole career just trying to get that stuff down because it takes a while to get it all down. Yes?
I think there's a short in
Is there? I don't know if I...
Does it sound like there's a short?
Am I going in and out?
Yeah.
I can't tell.
Maybe if you push the wiring more, you pause.
Well, maybe that's it.
I think that's it.
Maybe if I keep moving around. Let's try another one. All right, let's try another one.
And I do have a
Sorry about
question. No, it's not.
Yeah.
That's our fault. How do you avoid that, what is it called, an uncanny, like the Polar Express, where you look pretty realistic, but also look super freaky?
The uncanny valley.
Yeah.
It's hard to avoid with motion capture animation when you're dealing with keyframe. So keyframe animation is like what I was describing, where you're posing it from one frame to the next, and then interpolating between those. And that's kind of like the same as 2D animation on paper or computer animation, where you're setting keyframes like frame 1 and frame 10, and then you're doing all the fun stuff in between. Whereas motion capture is like an entirely different thing, where they will have an actor come in and he or she will wear a suit with sensors all over the body, and then they put them in a special room with cameras all around, and that records all of their motion. And so there's no longer a need for keyframe because the computer is recording everything that they're doing. And then that motion capture data is brought into a computer software and maybe applied to a character. And so that character is now just using all the motion that the actor created. And then the problem is when it's super hyper-realistic kind of stuff, like facial stuff, like on Polar Express, I don't even know exactly what that's creating, why it's creating that, but you've all seen it where it just gets this really kind of dead eye thing in there. It's tough to even, we've played with it so much, and everyone try to come up with techniques like how to get rid of that. And as you see, because it still exists in all those films, it's something that I don't think they've even really mastered yet or gotten over that yet. So it's one of those weird things. I was going to talk about real quick, because I know a lot of people ask often, is switching from 2D to CG animation and what that was like and what we went through. it was an interesting time. We were working in 2D animation, and it was kind of funny because we always considered ourselves like the pure or the real artists because we were drawing on paper, and Pixar was doing some films like Toy Story and Bugs Life and that kind of thing. And we knew they were doing those, and we knew as those movies were coming out, they were getting more and more popular. But we were kind of in denial because we wanted to keep doing hand-drawn animation. And we felt that, you know, when you saw those early films from Pixar, Toy Story, Bugs Life, they were kind of rigid bodies, you know, the bugs, and then all the toys. And they couldn't do, at that time, really good, fluid animation. It always moved kind of stiff when you see those old films. And especially the humans. You know, we remember on the old early Toy Story, like Andy's mom and Andy, they always looked really kind of weird, you know, the humans. And so we kept telling ourselves, well, as long as they can't do really good, fluid, nice, beautiful animation like we were doing in hand-drawn stuff, we're going to be okay. Like, that fad's eventually going to go away and we'll be fine. So that's kind of what we were telling ourselves over at Disney. And I remember the day we were working on the Emperor's New Groove, and somebody had brought in the new trailer for the Pixar, their latest film. And so they said, have you guys seen this new trailer? We're like, no, like, what are they doing now? You know, all kind of smug. And they said it's this new film called Monsters Incorporated. I'm like, all right. So we put it on, we're watching this trailer. And if you remember that first teaser trailer, it was in Boo's bedroom, it's all dark, and the closet slowly opens, and these two creatures fall out and onto her floor. And the first guy, the little Mike Wazowski, the little green guy, stands up, and we're like, all right. But behind him was this blue, furry monster, and he stands up, and he's got this big stretch, and this beautiful fur that just floats so nicely. And there was, I remember in the room, there was just this collective, they did it. Look at that thing, it just moves so high. And we're like, oh man, all right, this is gonna put us out of a job. And it was just like, and then after that they did The Incredibles, and it looked even better. And so we knew at that point, like, we better learn this new tool if we're gonna stay employed. And I remember the day, this is in Burbank, the Disney feature animation, down in the basement, they had this huge room with all these computer workstations. And before that trailer came out, like, you wouldn't be caught dead down there because nobody wanted to admit that we were learning computer animation. After Monsters, Inc. came out, you couldn't find an empty seat down there. Everybody was like, you gotta learn the new software. And so it kind of eventually went that way. You know, Disney made their last hand-drawn film at the time was The Home on the Range, the cow one. They tried to bring it back a little bit. They did Princess and the Frog, and then they did a Winnie the Pooh, and both of them did not do as well, and so then they eventually scrapped the whole thing, the hand-drawn stuff. And then DreamWorks the same with Sinbad, before they went full CG with Shark Tale and Over the Hedge and all those. And so it was kind of a weird time, you know, a lot of people up to that point, including myself, I didn't even own a computer. I had to go buy my very first desktop, and so I'm not only trying to learn this new, just basic computer skills, but now I also have to learn this new software, this new tool to just to stay employed and keep working. And so I was fortunate enough to do that. A lot of people weren't. There was a lot of people that ended up just leaving the industry because they wanted to keep drawing, or they just were so unfamiliar with a computer, that kind of thing. So it was a really unusual time with that. Wow, it's going fast. But we could open it up to Q&A. I don't know if you want me to keep talking about my career and.
There's 10 or 15 minutes that open up to
Yeah.
if you're good.
Oh, totally. So I kept doing the CG stuff, and like I said, I got into the games. And the computer animation for video games, And I'll touch on this real quick because it's kind of interesting. People often ask like, well, what's the difference with film animation versus game animation? And probably the biggest thing is when you're watching a feature film, animated film, as an audience, you're not really, you're not always going to know what's going to happen on the screen. And so because of that, what animators, the animation principles that Walt and Ben developed way back then was this thing called anticipation. And anticipation in animation is kind of like the big wind-up. You see like the old Bugs Bunny cartoons when he's going to throw a pitch and he has a really exaggerated wind-up. But the anticipation is kind of like the wind-up before the punch, or the squat down before the jump. There's all kinds of anticipations that you have to build in to the motion of the character for feature film, because it kind of helps the audience know what's about to happen. So anticipation is a big thing with feature film. Well, when I got into game animation, they gave me a scene. I remember, I think it was on, it might have been on God of War, one of those. We had to do like a punch animation. And so when I first animated it, because I came from feature film, I put this big anticipation in, and then it throws the punch. Well, the thing I found out really quickly is when you're playing a video game, you're no longer in the audience anticipating what's going to happen. You're now controlling what's going to happen. So because of that, because you're in control of the action, you don't need a big anticipation. In fact, if you were to play a video game and you had a guy, a monster attacking you, and you hit punch, if that character went, and then threw that punch, it would feel like it's in the mud. Like it would just be like, what happened? Like it would be like slow motion if you had that anticipation all the time. So I remember doing my first game animation, and I did that big wind up, and I remember my supervisor just like shaking his head like, take the first 30 frames of 60 frames of your animation and just chop it off. We don't need any of that. So now when I did the animation for a punch, the character's standing there and it's just pow. It has to be responsive. And that's the big difference, is because you're now controlling that action. And so it's kind of cool how that works. And we found out as I started learning about more game animation stuff, is how it works is you have a library of motions that are in a video game. So you have, and everything kind of comes off the same motion. You know, when you have a character in a video game, he's kind of like at this neutral stance, and he's just standing there. And so everything kind of comes off of that same pose. So when a character goes to punch, you know, obviously he's not going to do the big wind-up, but he's going to go pow. So you have all these little tiny animations that are all working together off of that same pose. So it may be a punch, it may be a jump, it may be a duck, depending on what the character's doing in the game. There is also reaction animations that have to be made. So there's, you know, the hit, there's the small hit, there's the big hit that knocks them down. And so you have all these little animations is what the animators are creating. They're all really short and really fast. And then you take all those animations and you work with the programmer or the coder. The computer programmer takes all those little bits of animations that you made and they write the code so that when you're hitting those buttons on your controller, the computer in a split nanosecond is going through that library and finding the animation and to play it as you're hitting the button. So it's super fast. And then the character itself also has like this invisible cone around it that you can't see. And that cone is going to play animations depending on what happens to that character. So if somebody fires a projectile and once it hits that invisible cone, the code is going to find the reaction to play that, you know, to play the reaction. And so it's kind of cool how that works. So we're working hand in hand with the coders, with animation. And so when I worked in game studios, there was always like half artists and half computer programmers and coders, and we were kind of forced to work with each other. And I'll tell you, the coders don't like artists. And artists aren't that thrilled with coders because we always feel like they're messing up our stuff and we're messing up the vice versa. But we actually need each other all the time because we can't create the game without them writing the code for all of our animations, and they need us to create all this content. So there was a lot of that collaboration that you had to have all the time, you know, because some of the things also that they would do is, you know, oftentimes you would give like a jump animation into a game. Well, the character's not really jumping. We just do this, and then we do a cycle of him doing this, and then we do the land animation. Well, you give that to the coder, he's the one applying the velocity and the gravity to launch him across the sky. So as he's flying through the sky, it's playing this animation that you made. And then when it gets close to the ground, the invisible cone detects where the ground is, and then it plays the land. So oftentimes, the programmer puts all that stuff in there, but he may not launch him up as fast as an animator thinks it should look, or he may not land as hard as we would like it to. And so the artists, animators, were always going back and bugging the coders. Can you launch them up faster, or can you have them land harder? So there was a lot of that back and forth. And the way that they would do it is they would go into their code and do all their math, magic, whatever, and make that happen. And so, but it would keep going back and forth all the time. And eventually the coders got tired of us going in there and bugging them, making it land harder and this and that. And I remember one of the animators that was a little more tech savvy than the rest of us, we started figuring out how to go into the code and playing with those numbers. The problem is because we're all artists, we don't know what we're doing. If anyone knows about code, if you get one little space off or you misspell something, it destroys the whole game. It just comes crashing down. And you get this filter train crash that goes throughout the whole studio, and because they're computer programmers, they know exactly when and where and who did it. And so you suddenly get this angry email, another animator broke the game, and then they would roll back everything and wipe out all those changes that we made. And so they kept trying to discourage us to like leave their code alone. But we kept wanting to make stuff look better. So eventually what they did is the coders got together and they said, how do we keep these, you know, rotten animators from messing with our code? They came up with this kind of like a simplified version of their code, this interface. And it literally had big giant buttons, and it was all in color. It was like, hit this button if you wanted to go faster. And it was like coding like for kindergartners. And it said, use this, stay out of our code, and use these big bright buttons, and that will make things a lot easier. And so that's what we ended up doing. So I did the video game stuff, and then eventually, yeah, like I was saying, I eventually went to full-time freelance because I was drawing again, and I just started doing a lot of that stuff, just drawing my own stuff. And that's opened doors to things like working with Foo Fighters, and working on a lot of different projects, whether it's car stuff with the Rat Fink, Comic-Cons. I got to work on a couple other films, doing various things like that. And so that's kind of where I am now. So, we can open up to questions if you like.
Could we see some of the Foo Fighters stuff too?
Oh, let me see if I can find it. I think I need to log back in with Mr. Andrew. I'm borrowing his computer. So Foo Fighters, I've been doing a lot of this Rat Fink kind of style artwork. And
two of your paintings are up here in the stairwell.
Yes, you can see those as well. So let me see if I can find some of that Foo stuff. I've been a big music fan forever, and so because of my animation background, I do a lot of caricatures and that kind of thing. And so I started drawing different bands like Foo Fighters. I don't know if I can find that little folder. Got a lot of them here. Foo Assets. So I started drawing some Foo Fighter, just kind of fan art. and I was posting it online. And so there's one of them that I did. And as I was posting this stuff online, one day on Twitter, I got a notification that said Foo Fighters liked my post. And to me, that was enough. I was like freaking out, running around the house. Oh my God, they liked my post. And a couple days later, I got another notification, and it said Foo Fighters are now following you. And now I'm really freaking out. And then a couple minutes go by, and I get a private message from Foo Fighters. And now I'm just like, all right, someone's messing with me. And this can't be real. But I look, it's like blue check, 3 million followers. Like, oh my God, it's actually them. And so they messaged me. This was in 2017, and they said, she said, "Hi, this is Kristen from Foo Fighters HQ. We really love your stuff." They were going to be playing in Salt Lake City. They said, we'd love to give you a couple tickets, go out and do a backstage thing. And by the way, if you're down, we'd love to talk to you about doing something. And now my head's like, exploding. And so they were doing this festival in that was going to be in 2018 called Cal Jam. And it was like a 3-day festival in San Bernardino. And it was going to have campers and motorhomes and all this stuff. And they said, we kind of like your stuff because it kind of feels like Rat Fink, Mad Magazine, just kind of homemade. And they like that style. They said it just feels kind of gritty. And so they said, we want to do some artwork for that. So over the course of the following year, I just started doing this kind of stuff. Like they said, we want to do something with a Winnebago. And they said, maybe if they're hanging out the windows, and I said, what if we do them on top? And they're like jamming, and the things like Rat Fink tearing through, and they're like, oh yeah, that'd be great. So over the course of that year, it was just like that kind of thing. I was just doing different artwork and submitting it to them, and they would say, I would get feedback from the management. They're like, Dave Grohl loves this one. Yeah, send that one in. And so I'm just sending this stuff in over the year. But I didn't always know what it was going to be used for. I was just sending stuff in, and they're like, yeah, that one's cool. And so when the festival, Cal Jam, was finally happening, they invited us down, and it was really cool because they put us up into this really huge, like, luxury RV that we got to stay in. But I remember the first day we showed up, and they said, go down to this gate, and this guy's going to come, and he's going to take you to your RV where you're staying. And so the guy shows up in this golf cart, and he's wearing like the lanyard, and it has it's like the all access lanyard, like the top one that you get into everything. And on that lanyard was this piece of art, and it was like all access, and it had this drawing. And now I'm like a 10-year-old, like I'm geeking out. I'm like, hey, that's my drawing. And he's all like, yeah, like, why do you think you're here? And I said, well, I didn't know it was going to be on that. So I'm all excited. And so everywhere, so they put us into this RV, which is really cool. And as we're walking around in this festival ground, we just start discovering like my artwork all over the place. So like they took this image here, and they put it on a giant banner, and they gave it to all the people that had purchased the RV camping for the 3-day festival. So as we're walking around, everyone has this banner flying with that artwork on it. And it was like just so cool because we're just walking around like, oh my God, there it is. And then we went around the corner, and they had a life-size old nasty Winnebago all stuck to the outside and in the windows. They made like life-size standees of Dave Grohl and the band. It was all my drawings, and there was like a long line of people doing photo ops, standing next to it. And so it's just cool stuff like that because I had no idea it was going to be like anywhere of those things. And so it was just a really cool experience, And then I remember after it was over, they were going to announce Cal Jam 19. And I remember emailing Kristen like, all right, Cal Jam 19, I got these ideas. What if we do this, this, and that? And she says, yeah, they usually work with different artists for different events. And it was great working with you. Really nice stuff. But yeah, take care. It was nice. So that was about it. But it was a once-in-a-lifetime thing. I was so thrilled just to be part of that, and so yeah, it was really cool.
And Dave Grohl has one of your paintings in his studio, right?
Yeah, so there was a painting, I don't know if I have that one here. There was a painting I was able to get to Dave Grohl, which was really cool. Yeah, I don't have it here. And then the other thing that happened is after the whole Foo Fighters thing happened, Taylor Hawkins, if you remember, you guys familiar with Taylor Hawkins, was the drummer of the Foo Fighters. He has all these like side bands because those guys are always playing all the time. So I got to do some work with one of his side bands was Chevy Metal. And they're like a cover band, like Taylor would sing and play drums, and then he had a bass player and another guitar player. So I got to do stuff with them, which was really cool. But one of the most touching things that happened was after Taylor had passed away, Wiley Hodgkin, he was the bass player for Chevy Metal. He contacted me after Taylor had passed, and I was, I'm still so upset that that happened. But he messaged me and he says, hey, do you have an image? Do you have a copy of this image? And he sent me a screenshot of a painting that I had done of Chevy Metal. And I couldn't remember. I was like, yeah, I think I do, because I always scan all my artwork. And I said, why? And he's like, well, Taylor loved this piece that you did. I wish I had. And I said, that's cool. Like, where did he see it? Like, where did he see it? And he's like, dude, he owned it. Like, he owned the original. And I said, where did he get it from? And he said, I don't know if somebody bought it or gave it to him or something, but he had it framed in his home studio, and he had it in a really prominent spot because he was really proud of it. And I'm just crying now. And I was just so touched by that Taylor Hawkins owned one of my pieces that I had no idea, and that he had it framed and hanging in his studio. And so I'm like, man, that's so cool. I was just thanking him for sharing that with me. And so yeah, it was a really, really neat experience for me to, whenever an artist, it always blows my mind that people will take my artwork and hang it on their walls. Like, to me, that's just so cool that somebody would do that. Whether it's Taylor Hawkins or anybody, like I often get people send me, stuff on social media, and they have my artwork hanging somewhere in their house, and I was like, wow, that's really neat that they would do that. So to find out that Taylor Hawkins did that, especially after he passed, was really special for me. So, anyways, back to everything else. Do we have any questions? We have some time. We can do that. Yes.
I'm kind of curious. Like, you were in the original Emperor's New Groove development hell that Crazy has had for a few years. I'm kind of curious. Did you like the original version, King of the Sun, better than what it turned into, or like, what are your opinions on that?
I remember. So when I came to work at Disney on Emperor's New Groove, I got there right when they changed everything. In fact, they just changed the title of the movie. It was, like you said, it was called Kingdom of the Sun. And I remember everyone hated the new title, Emperor's New Groove, because nobody knew what that even meant. And they just changed the directors, and they changed all the story. And so when I got there, it was like we had half the time. So they had been working on this movie for quite a while, and they ended up scrapping most of it. They saved a lot of it, but a lot of it got scrapped. The only thing that didn't change was the deadline to get it all finished. So I came in about halfway, and we were doing an entirely new film in that time. And so it was cool for me. Like, I didn't see a lot of that early stuff, but it was kind of cool because it just led to this kind of frantic pace that kind of, you see that in the film, just the whole vibe of it was like that. And so there was a few things that I remember seeing, but from what I remember, I like the second version better just because it had that crazy kind of feel to it. And it was just all that because we were just in such a rush to get the whole thing done again. One of the interesting stories I'll tell you with that is, if you're familiar with that movie, there's that long scene with the long table and Yzma, and they're planning, and Cusco's there, and they're planning like his demise, and when that scene first opens, it's a close-up of a little candelabra. It's a little statue of this guy holding the two candles, and then it zooms back and it's that long table. Well, that little guy used to be a character in the early version of the film. I I forgot what his name was, but he was like this little talisman, little statue guy, and he would come to life, and he was always pestering Yzma, and kind of the running gag in that early version is Yzma was always threatening to turn him into a candelabra. So later, when they changed the film, he got written out of the movie, and so they ended up using him as the prop of the little candelabra, and that's what you see him as now when that scene opens. So it was this turned into this little inside joke, like Yzma finally got her way with this guy. And so when you see that, you'll notice that's one of the pieces from the early versions of the film. Yes?
For Prince of Egypt, what scene did you do, or what sequence did you make?
So the way it worked in 2D film is when you got onto a movie, you would get cast onto a specific character. Because we were drawing that character, they wanted to make sure it stayed consistent. And so I got cast onto the Moses unit, which I was really happy about. So I worked with about, probably 50 other artists just drawing Moses. And so I worked on a lot of Moses scenes. I remember the very first one I worked on, if you're familiar with that movie, there's a montage after Moses leaves Egypt, and they show him in the desert, and they show the vastness of the desert getting bigger and bigger, and Moses is getting smaller and smaller. So I remember my very first scene, working in animation, I was drawing Moses, and he was about that big. He had no face, no features. It was just this little tiny figure walking. And I was flipping the pages, drawing this little tiny Moses. But I was so thrilled. I couldn't believe that they were going to pay me to do this for a living. And so, yeah, that was the first thing that I did. And then there was a bunch of various Moses scenes throughout the movie. So I got to work on young Moses and old Moses. But it was almost entirely Moses is all I did on that one. Thanks. Yes?
Outside of Rat Fink, before starting it all, throughout your career, what character would you say held the most personal significance to you?
Probably for me, it would probably go back to Prince of Egypt because it was my first film and it was the first thing that I got to work on professionally, and it was just such an amazing thing. Like I couldn't believe, like it was just this dream come true. You know, as any artist, like when you're a kid, you know, you just dream like, man, if I get to do this, and I never thought I could do this for a living. For a long time, art to me was just a hobby. And so to actually be able to do that professionally, and so I always go back to that film. I like that one a lot, and just working, just that whole environment. It was exciting. It was DreamWorks. It was a brand new studio, their first film, and so all of that just combined is always something that's really special to me. Yeah.
What was it like on Gears?
Which one?
Gears?
Gears of War. That was kind of crazy. So when I worked on Gears of War, I was working for a company. It was actually Technicolor. Technicolor at that time had a small game division, and what we were doing is we were kind of like a contract house. So we were picking up games, helping a lot of other studios, usually to finish their game because they were getting towards the end of the deadline. And so everything that we worked on when I was at Technicolor was crunch, on fire, we gotta get this done right now. And so because that's where they were, whether it was Epic or Sony, Naughty Dog, we did the Uncharted. So we were just picking up contract work. So when we worked on Gears, everything was just bam, full blast, jump on it, work on it as fast as you can, stay up all late, and then it was on to the next game. So I don't remember a lot of it, but I know a lot of it was motion capture. So they were sending us a lot of mocap data, and we were cleaning it up. So when you get raw mocap data, like I was talking about with the actors, when it's raw, it's really raw. It's like jittery. There's stuff passing through each other. Like those characters on Gears of War, they're huge, and the giant armor that they're wearing is massive. Well, when the actors recorded all that stuff, we always told them, like, why don't they put giant styrofoam or something around them? Because it's just regular guys walking around. So now we're taking animation, mocap, of regular guys walking around, but now it's being applied to these models that are massive. So you can imagine all the arms are passing through each other, the legs are passing through each other. So you have to take all that mocap data, and there's filters and tools in the program to smooth all the jitter stuff. but also move that stuff out. And so you're just going through and tweaking all that stuff. And so it was a little dry because I was a keyframe animator. I wanted to do the fun illusion of life stuff, and something like that, whenever it's mocap, you're kind of just messing with all that data. Yes?
So when you switched to 3D, because you were kind of on the illustration side, did you feel like you still got to like fulfill that like drawing part of it? Like,
Not so much, and I think that's why I eventually quit to just go back to just become a full-time illustrator, because from Shark Tale all the way through to Disney Infinity and then Warner Brothers, it was all CG. So I didn't draw a lot during that time because I was so focused on trying to master this computer animation and trying to learn the new tools. And so yeah, I missed a lot of the drawing. And so in 2016, a friend of mine was doing a Comic-Con in Salt Lake City, and he had a booth and he was drawing stuff. And I went to go help him. I did an Infinity panel with him because he was a storyboard artist with me. So doing that and then hanging around his booth and watching him draw, I was like, man, that's cool. Like you're drawing stuff and having fun. And so he convinced me to get my own booth the following year. But to do that, I had to draw a lot of my own new stuff again. So I just started drawing like crazy, and it just sparked this thing where it was like, I love drawing, and it just took off from there, where eventually I literally quit my job just so I could start drawing again. Yes?
I was wondering how you initially got into like the gaming industry, like the whole process of it.
It was because we had switched to computer animation and feature film, and so what happens a lot in feature film is they have large crews of people working on a movie. Whenever they start a new movie, producers always have it in their head, because they're the budget guys and the bean counters they call them. They always have this idea that we're going to make the movie, instead of with 500 people on this film, this next one we're going to do it with 75 people. It's going to be awesome. And so that's how they pitch it. And what happens a lot of times, if you're not like a rock star animator, which I never was, I was kind of a rank and file guy, when they get onto that next film and they decide we're going to do this with the skeleton crew, you often get laid off in between films. In fact, every movie that I worked on, it was a nail biter if I was going to get onto the next movie. So I found myself after Home on the Ring, Over the Hedge, I got laid off because they were starting, they had a couple of movies. I think it was the Bee Movie and Kung Fu Panda. And a lot of these films often have story problems in between. And so whenever there's story problems, the production gets shelved, and all the rank and file animators often get laid off because they don't want to sit around doing nothing. And so that's kind of what happened. That's the same thing that happened after The Road to El Dorado. I did Prince of Egypt, El Dorado. I was supposed to go on to Spirit, and the same thing happened. It had some story issues. A lot of us got laid off, and they kept saying, 3 or 4 months, we should be good, we'll call you back. Well, that turned into 5 months. And then I did some freelance on the Tigger movie just to try to pay the bills. And then it became 6 or 7 months, well, we should be calling you back. So at that time I was like, well, I can't wait any longer, and I applied and got into Disney. And so it was kind of that. But since I had this new computer thing, I was in between jobs, and I'd heard Technicolor was hiring because they were picking up all this contract work. And so I got in doing that. So that kind of opened up the door to the video game stuff. And then we found with video games, there were so many of them, and they were making them all the time, that there was a lot more job security in game stuff. And so I just kind of stayed there from there on out. I think Over the Hedge was my last feature film, just because video games just seemed like, oh, they're paying well, and there's plenty of work, and so we'll just keep doing that. Yes?
Did you ever try to combine both 3D and 2D animation, like with Sergio Pablo's like Klaus, or like Andrew Chadwick's stuff?
The one movie that was really big that we did do a lot of that was Treasure Planet. Treasure Planet was a film that was being made at a time when the CG stuff was getting better and bigger, and they were trying to come up with new stuff to keep 2D going. So that was a film where you had literally a full 2D characters with Jim and all of them. You had a full CG character with Ben, the robot, was all CG. And then you literally had a character that was a hybrid with Silver. where he was hand-drawn, but he had a CG arm and a CG eye, and so that was a hybrid of both of them. The thing that made it difficult with that character, we found, like I was talking earlier about stuff being animated on twos where they could use a single drawing for 2 frames of film. They found with the CG stuff, it didn't work very well in 24 frames per second, that it would strobe if it were on twos. So they had to do all the CG stuff on ones, which means a separate image for each frame. So now all the hand-drawn stuff that was connected to Silver all had to be drawn on ones. So that entire character is all one single drawing per frame. So like double the workload for those guys that were on Jim. I fortunately was not on, in Silver, I was on the Jim Hawkins character, but all the Silver stuff was like a lot of work because of that. And it made the animation really nice and smooth because you had a single image for all those. And that's one of the big differences too when you see like the direct-to-video stuff or a lot of TV animation. Sometimes people look at like the sequels of like the Jungle Book sequel on DVD, and they often wonder, why does it just feel kind of choppy and not so smooth as the feature film stuff? The big reason is, like I said, animated on twos or on ones, they're using a single image for just 2 frames of film. Well, like TV stuff or direct-to-DVD stuff, they'll animate stuff on 6s or 8s, where they may use a drawing for 6 frames of film before that drawing changes again. So you can imagine what that does to the animation. It suddenly just makes it just feels kind of choppy because they're not using as many drawings. And so that's a big thing. But yeah, that was probably the best example I had of combining those two. Yes?
This can either be like 2D or 3D or maybe both. What would you say was either the tedious or your most favorite character to work on?
The most tedious was probably well, it's funny now that I look back at it, I didn't have a lot to compare it to, but Prince of Egypt was my first film, and I didn't know it was as tedious as it was until I started working on other stuff. But that one was really tedious because it had such a level of detail. I remember talking to other like veteran animators that had been in the business for a long time, and they always told me how much more detailed that film was. And it wasn't until later that I looked back, oh yeah, that one was really tedious. And so Prince of Egypt was probably my favorite thing to work on was Disney Infinity, the video game, because it was this mashup of so many different characters. You had classic Disney and Pixar and Marvel and Star Wars was all in this game. So as an animator, that was like a dream come true because we just had the pick of all this different stuff that you wanted to work on. So we got to work on all these different characters and different styles of animation. You know, because things move differently and animation is styled differently. So if you have Woody, you know, he's really floppy, and so his animation is gonna look different than Marvel animation, where it's an action figure or that kind of thing. So I really liked working on that one just because of the variety of animation styles that we could do. So that was a lot of fun for me. Yes?
What was a memorable aspect to your contribution to the God of War franchise?
God of War, I remember we were working on a lot of the cutscenes. At the time, you don't get a lot of context to what it is you're doing, so they'll give you scenes, and we're just like, what the world is this? I remember working on a scene of him hanging on chains under giant hands. And I don't remember a lot of these, but I remember working on that, and just this character swinging on these chains, and just wondering like, what is this? You know, there was a lot of that stuff, because you didn't always know. Stuff was coming in so fast. And so I have all these images of different scenes that I worked on, but I didn't always know what the context was. And I'm not a big gamer, unfortunately. So I'd be working on these games, and oftentimes I never even saw them when they were finished, because I didn't play a lot of games. And so that was one of the big ones. I remember working on that for a long time. There was another scene of, I think it was some angelic character that comes flying in with really big wings, and so you know.
Yeah.
But there was a bunch of those. A lot of them were really short, again, also because it was contract work. So we would be working on like God of War 2, maybe only for 3 or 4 weeks. And then all of a sudden I'm working on Spyro the Dragon. We'll do that for a few weeks. And then it would go really bizarre, like Saints Row 4, where I'm just like, what in the world is this? Like, somebody's writing this stuff? And then it would switch gears, and then we'd be working on Uncharted, and so it was a lot of just fast-moving stuff at that time. Yeah.
I was just wondering, since you switched from, film and video games and now doing like illustration and painting, if at any point in the future you're planning on making any new like work that's in any way narrative, or are you mainly just interested in doing like, like kind of single
Right.
like images?
Not too much, and the main reason is within the animation process, there's all these, it's like an assembly line. You have all these disciplines that everybody's working together with. So you have storyboard artists and concept artists, and you have animators, and there's effects artists and lighting, all those different disciplines all to make like a narrative story. Well, when you work at a studio, even a medium-sized studio, but you get into somewhere big like DreamWorks or Disney, all those disciplines are very specialized to very specific artists doing just that thing. So as a character animator, all I did was character animation. They didn't want me messing around with storyboard because they had the best storyboard artists in the world just doing those. They had the best concept artists just doing that stuff. Even modeling the character, they have modelers building those characters. And so my whole career in animation, I never ever went outside of my discipline because they didn't want me to. They needed me to be the best animator I could be. So when it comes to like making a short film or a cartoon, like people often ask me, like they want to hire me to do a cartoon or a short. I don't know the first thing about any of those other disciplines. Modeling a character, I couldn't tell you anything about it. And so because it's so specialized, and that's kind of one of the cool things about if anyone's in animation programs or in school, is that they will expose you to those different disciplines, which is really cool. But when you get into a professional field, you want to get really good at just one of those. And because when you apply to a studio, if you have a portfolio or a demo reel and you have a little bit of all those different disciplines, well, it first comes into HR, they have to direct your portfolio to one of those departments. And if you have everything on there and you just say, just put me anywhere, I'm happy just to be here. Well, they look at that, they're like, where do we send this? He's got storyboards and concept art and animation, and there's so many portfolios coming in all the time, they don't have time to sort through that, and it will often get tossed. So this is actually something good to remember. Even though you're learning those different disciplines in school, at some point you want to zero in on one of those and get really good at that. So when you submit your reel and you say, I want to be a storyboard artist, that should be the only thing on there. So when it comes in, they're like, boom, let's send that to storyboard department, and they can evaluate that. And so that's really important because oftentimes people think that when you're in animation programming, you're learning storyboard, character design, and all this stuff. Sometimes you think you have to know all of those. You really don't. You have to be really good at one of them. So that's something good to keep in mind. Yes?
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I teach an illustration and my students are here and I'm just feel thankful for you. My question is following up on that. So it kind of sounds like you're saying target your audience when you're, like if you are a young person going out there and you have your school portfolio and you really want to get in, you could sort of hone and direct your portfolio, cull together like one thing, so
Yes.
you might send it to the one studio for that and reach out to another studio
Absolutely.
with a different kind of product, but you're
You
customizing.
really have to focus. Like I was a supervising animator in the last few years of when I was working with Disney, and we would get portfolios all the time from everywhere. And there's just really no time to sort through, well, he's got some good animation on here, there's some good storyboards on here. We're really not sure where to put this person. It's really up to the applicant to really focus that portfolio to that specific thing. So if you see Pixar is hiring character animators and you want to be a character animator, that should be the only thing on there. so that when that comes in, it goes right to that department, because it's really that quick. You know, when they come in, they're sorting through those so fast, and if they see stuff on there that just doesn't belong there, or doesn't apply, it just gets tossed, unfortunately. They really just don't have the time to go in there, and so you really have to know which one do I want to do, which one am I going to get really good at, storyboard artist, concept art, and just have that stuff on there. You don't want to make it tough on them to throw that thing out because they have to go in and figure out what it is you want to do. Yes?
As an artist, how much creative freedom do you have within your 2D animation work from the past?
From where I was as an assistant animator, very little. Because I'm not only I was mentioning like the key drawings, drawing number 1 and drawing 10 from my supervisor. They've already determined what that motion's gonna be. The character designs were done long before it got onto my desk. And so there's not a lot there. As I got higher up the production as a supervising animator, then I can create more stuff and come up with some fun ideas, you know, when they just didn't have anything, like especially on game stuff. You know, the game animation, we got to work with designers and coders to come up with those motion sets. There's a lot of these, there would be tons of these animation idols. You know what those are when you're on a video game. The character's just standing there. And you know what happens if you don't move the controller? He does one of these, he does one of these, one of those. They would have lists and lists of those that they would give to the animators. Like, we need 20 idols for this character. Just come up with anything. So that was always a lot of fun, because it was like, all right, what can we do? You work with the prop guy. Can we have him pull, I remember with Mike Wazowski, I worked with the prop guy. I said, can we have him pull like a hula hoop from like behind his back, and he'll just start spinning around like Saturn, something. So it was always silly. So as you got a little bit higher up, you can have fun with that kind of thing. And the Rockstar animators, Disney and Pixar, they would set that stuff in motion, and then it would trickle down to the assistants until you get to the in-betweener, which was me, in between those iterations, frame by frame. But we were at that point just moving the animation along until you started learning more and getting higher up. Anything else? Boy, we're not over a little bit. Is that it? We all good? Yes, one more.
I guess how do we connect with you on social?
Yes, you can find me on anywhere on social media. If you look up Art of Thomas Estrada, you'll see me, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or any of those. And feel free to contact me. You know, one of the things that I always appreciated when I was starting out is whenever I found somebody that was working in the industry or doing anything with their artwork that bothered to take the time for me and talk to me, was always such a huge, I just felt so blessed that they would do that for me. And so I don't mind talking with people and sharing stuff if they want, you know, questions, that kind of thing, because it's sometimes you just don't know. You know, I had no direction at all when I was getting into animation. I just didn't know what they wanted. And so learning that stuff and finding somebody that took that time was always really cool. I don't take that for granted. So yeah, reach out if you want, if you have any questions. And I know we're about done, right? Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.